Okay, today the ds-incubator is the last of the first lesson in this series about using Git from the terminal. There is a few, this is more kind of theoretical from what I can see in the lesson. But before I do that, let me check that you can see my RStudio thingy and hear the lesson. Can you see that? Yeah, great. So the first, actually up here, the first subsection is this about writing useful commit messages. And it kind of all boils down to having something that looks like this. The first line is very important because it's the first, it is the line that will appear on the Git log. So we were discussing before the different ways of getting a useful Git log. And the command git log itself gives a comprehensive log, including the full commit message. But most people, use like the shorter version that shows just one line. So that's why, the subject line of the commit message is super important. And the way you create that subject line is by breaking the first line with an empty line and then adding whatever information you want to add below that. So first, that's the very kind of first useful rule, let's call it. Start with a commit message that has one line, then break it with an empty line, and then start typing whatever under that. Usefully, RStudio, the interface of RStudio, when you create a commit message, has a counter of characters. So if I start typing something like, here is my commit message, you can see that I have already typed 26 characters. And if I keep going, I will reach the point where I should stop, which is here. So 50 characters is the recommended limit, because beyond that, when you go to GitHub, you will get like ... right? So basically, when you see the list of commits as displayed on GitHub won't show more than 50 characters, and then it will start wrapping. So, it is, when you see, like instructions about how to write useful commit messages, many guys recommend that the first line has only 50 characters. Then it's an empty line, and then whatever else. And here you can go beyond, that's fine. In any case, my recommendation would be to keep more or less to the normal 80 characters length, because, that's kind of, when you write software in general, that's how you have your screen set up. Usually you use any extra space for other things. So if you write any text that goes beyond 80 characters, you will annoy a lot of people that have their screens already set that way, and they need to kind of go and drag windows and things. Like, it's kind of annoying. So that's it, really. One line, first line, with 80 characters, then an empty line, and then like any number of paragraphs that explain like the lower level of what you're doing. And the very first line is just a very high level, mostly focusing on why you did what you did, and that's it. I won't cover that in much greater detail. But I'm sure in your experience you may have develop your own things or anything in this room that that you would like to share about writing useful or reading useful commit messages before we move on to to discussing about Git Ignore. Nothing. Okay. So yeah, the rules are very simple. So for those who just joined, we were talking about how to write useful commit messages, and it all boils down to just one line, 50 characters or less, that describes the high level of what you've done, then one empty line, and then any number of paragraphs, ideally, wrapping at around 80 characters, but not so picky about that. The second part is something that it is covered in this lesson, but something that Alex, highlighted as important to cover, and I totally agree, which is this idea of managing your folders in your computer in a way that everything that you have there is either checked in Git or ignored, basically. So you don't have kind of files bothering you. Right? So say that if I have a file, I'm going to create a file called B. Let me clean this with Control L and do git status. You can see that there is a B file there. So if I don't want that file to live in the Git repository, then instead of just trying to every time remember to not commit it, the best thing I can do is to just ignore it. So you have this git ignore file that if you don't have it, you can create. It's just a text file, right? It's called git ignore. So that is the only convention that Git needs to know, that that file contains files that you don't want to include in the index. So if I say now B, I add the file B to the git ignore file. When I save that file, if I do a git status again, it should say that B is no longer there. The only change that has been registered is my change to git ignore. So I could do like git commit with the message add B to git ignore, and let's commit the file git ignore. So now if I do git status, you can see that my staging area is clean. So let's clear this up. Control L, git status again is clean. And if I modify the file B, so let's open the file B. If I modify this file with anything, these changes shouldn't be recorded by Git. If I do git status, yep, Git still says there's nothing to commit because I explicitly said that that file should be ignored. Because I use R a lot, they use these helpers for adding files to git ignore. So I could also have done something like this. So let's open git ignore again. Let's remove that file from git ignore. And let's add it via the use this package. So this comes from the use this package. So this function should have added the file B to git ignore. Maybe I don't know why I don't see it here. Let's see if I close here. Okay, here it is. It looks like it wasn't refreshed. So why would you want to do that? Well, maybe you are you need to ignore a lot of files in one go, and you may be using a function like lapply to pass a list of files that you want to ignore, and then the function would be use this use git ignore use git ignore, right? So in this case, if my list contains just the file, if I want to ignore file A, B, and C, this will should update my git ignore file with all those files there. So that's a quick way. And by the way, what I just showed is something that applies to the idea of iterating over vectors. It's something that nothing to do with Git, but some people have shown interest in that. So yeah, there it is. So one application of how to iterate over a list, in this case a vector, and apply a function to all of those items in the list. So for git ignore, the syntax to ignore files uses the glob syntax. So there is a very useful link here to learn how to use that feature. So basically it says that you could use something like you could ignore something like everything that is a txt file with something like this, right? Txt, and that will ignore every txt file. So it is very succinct, and you can do a lot of things in a very compact way. And to learn more, just click that link and inform how to do that. And then there is one thing that has been biting us a lot in Pacta analysis repo. I don't know if that is what fixes the problem, but it's this idea that sometimes you add a file already to a Git repository, and then later you start ignoring it. So let me demonstrate that example here. So let me clean my git ignore file. Let me commit it. So now actually the file B, I don't want it here. Let's just delete it. Remove B. So B, let's say that B is a file that I added recently. and I added it to the git ignore before I created the first commit with that file. So git status should now show, what did I do with B? Because I deleted it. Maybe that's a kind of bad example. Git add B, git commit, delete. Okay. And I also had this file A in my Git repository. So if I touch A now, Git should record a change, right? So I save this file, and let's do a git status. So as you can see, the file A has been modified, and Git records that. But what if I now decide to add A to git ignore? So I add it there, I save the file, and I hope that when I do git status, it will have disappeared, right? But it won't happen that way. So I have modified git ignore, right? But A continues to be there in the staging area. And the reason is because I created a commit that included the file A before I added to git ignore. So how do you work around that? Okay, so let me first commit add A to git ignore. Let me just, for now, work on git ignore, right? So let me commit the change to git ignore. So the change to A is still there, right? So what if I want it to disappear from there? Well, what you do is you need to update the index. So remember, the index is the place where Git stores information about everything, right? So if you do a git update index, and you can tell it, assume that the file A, you're gonna say now, is unchanged. And now you have to say the name of the file that you want Git to assume that it is unchanged, right? So with this, let's do a git status. And now A disappeared. Let me clean this up and then do it again. Git status A. Or git status in general. Oh, sorry. Git status, right? So now Git knows that although I had added that file in the beginning, now I decided I no longer want Git to track it. If I want to undo that, it is as easy as say no assume unchanged, right? So with this, if I do git status, now A appears back again in my staging area. So that is generally more than you want to know about ignoring files. This idea of assuming unchanged is kind of not so common, but sometimes you need it. Alex, what am I missing about git ignoring files or anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, a couple of big things. One is if you have added a file to the repository already and later add it to the git ignore, it will still track changes on that file. So let's say I add a data file and commit it, and then later I'm like, oh no, I can't add data files to my repository, put it in git ignore. It'll still be tracking that data file, and more importantly, that data file will still be in the history, available to whoever downloads that repository in the future. So be very generous when creating your git ignores and include things that basically from the beginning include anything that you know you're not going to want in there. Second is
sorry, maybe before you move on, Alex.
Yeah.
How do you then go about ignoring something that you've already committed?
So it really depends on, is it bad that it's in there? Like if you accidentally commit your .rproj.user file, that's not the end of the world. It's just like a minor inconvenience. You can delete it out of there and it won't be there again. passwords to our database, right? Not that anyone would ever do that. Certainly, I've never done it. If that happens, it's not the end of the world. It's just kind of a pain to clean up. How to clean it up is well beyond the scope of this. But if that happens, to talk to me, talk tomorrow. Like, we can handle it, but there's just like a very complicated flow chart of, have you already pushed, have you committed, like many different ways that can get fixed. So yeah, I'm willing to help anyone. The important thing is, like, if you commit something you really shouldn't, let us know. We're not going to judge you. We've all made that mistake before. But it is, cleaning it up is just something that needs to happen.
Thanks.
Does that answer your question, Claire?
Yeah. Basically, yeah, it's tricky.
Yeah. But so that's the thing, is like, just putting something in the git ignore file, that protects against the future, but it does not fix the current situation. So another thing that I want to talk about real quick, and I don't know if Mara was going to touch on this or not, but it's the global git ignore, which I find to be super useful. And basically, that is a file that lives on your computer, not as part of the Git repository, but in like your user settings. And it's a git ignore that applies to every repository on your computer. It's the global thing. So if you use a text editor like Vim or Sublime, or if you're on a Mac, a lot of the time you'll see ds-store files show up in your Git statuses. If you add those files to your global git ignore, then it just ignores them everywhere. So I'll put some instructions in the coding channel of how to set that up on each of your computers. And I already put in a link to GitHub has a repository where they just have a bunch of template git ignore files. So it's like, if you're working on an R project, here are the common git ignore files for every R project. If you're working on Python, here's all of the Python files. So that's just a good place to get started. That's my bit.
That's great. Thanks a lot. Yeah, no, I wasn't going to cover the global. I'm familiar with it, so great that you did. And also because it wasn't in this lesson, so I totally forgot. So awesome for you complementing that. So that is, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Clarification about this assume unchanged option. So this leaves the file in the repo, but just basically ignores any further changes to it. So like if someone else closes repo, then that file would still exist there. It's not like getting rid of it. It's just preventing any further changes from happening to it.
That's right. As far as I understand it, it is so that the changes that you do locally do not change the state of the file in the Git repo. Go ahead, Alex, please.
Yeah. One other thing about assume unchanged and no assume unchanged is it's a very finicky thing, and a little bit on the dangerous side to use. I would not encourage us to use it in any way, because if I run git assume unchanged on my machine, that only applies to my computer. It doesn't propagate to anyone else's. So if I have notes.txt in my repo and I'm like, I don't want to commit this, I'm going to just assume it's unchanged. Well, if Mauro checks it out on his computer and makes some changes, then those would commit. And then when I pull it back down, it's going to be a mess, because I will have my changes, I will have Maro's changes, and Git won't know how to resolve that. So if you are planning on using assume unchanged or no assume unchanged rather than just using the git ignore defaults, ask yourself really why are you doing that, and communicate a lot with the rest of the team when you do it, because that's saying everyone else also has to do that.
Yeah. One. Okay. I mean, I totally endorse what you're saying. But of course, if the tool is there, is because there is some very edge cases that maybe it's useful. And I wanted to mention one case that just to kind of see an example. But that's I totally agree that generally it is exposing like a very weird case, and maybe it shouldn't have made it to this lesson. Maybe I mean, it's not that it wasn't the lesson. I'm just extending the lesson with things that come from our experience. So, for example, in the case when you render an R Markdown file, what you get there is an MD output that sometimes has some differences with the version that is checked in, and those differences sometimes are not useful because it's just the change of the date or something like that. So in my case, we have been kind of working with this file where everyone has to put their own path to their computers and things like that in a configuration file. And I because of how I was working locally, and that file kept changing all the time. Everyone touched it. So I decided that at least from my end, I didn't add any changes to that file. So I added to assume unchanged. But then I also learned probably what Alex is suggesting. I'm pretty new to using that command, and probably I'll stop using it after hearing Alex, because it was unclear, some merge conflicts and things that seem to be kind of happening in the background, but were not obvious. So yeah, I think that in some probably I should say is forget about that command. So thanks, Alex, for highlighting the dangers of it. So we are kind of close to the end of the meetup and of the lesson. What we have there is a section on graphical user interfaces. The only thing I would like to say about that is that if that they are totally okay to use, I encourage them. And I heard good things about Git Kraken, and then there is a couple of ones listed here. I also heard good things about source tree. Honestly, what I use personally is our Studio's interface and a lot of the terminal, and that's why we're having this meetup. But I would like to open kind of the room to discuss for a few seconds that graphical user interfaces. If you have any questions, or if you want to share something that maybe you saw your user interface having improved a lot and you want to recommend it or something.
Definitely not a recommendation. I've been struggling a lot with using Git from a combination of the terminal and up on the right. In that sometimes I think I've pushed something through the terminal, but won't see a change happening in the sort of top right, and that confuses me, to say the least.
If I can comment on that, one tool one trick that I have learned is that the Git client in RStudio doesn't refresh its data constantly. So if you navigate away to a different pane and then if you go to the environment or the history pane and then come back, that may make your life a little easier in that regard, because it just sort of refreshes it. Or there is the little refresh button on the top right there next to the branch name. Second is, I strongly encourage people to use a GUI like RStudio or SourceTree. I know is free and I've used in the past. They make it hard to make mistakes. So that is a good thing in software. That when you're making your commit, they show very bit harder in that regard. So if you're sticking to just doing normal everyday things, they are spectacular and will make your life easier. But if you're going above and beyond that, knowing how to use the terminal definitely helps.
That's cool. And then in that case, maybe as Alex said before, maybe that's the time where we should be kind of communicating with each other anyway. So, if you find that what you want to do is beyond the scope of your graphical user interface, maybe it's time to just have a quick conversation with someone else that even if you can still do it on the terminal, maybe it's just a way to have a second pair of eyes on the same problem. So with that, we finished this meetup. What we have there is a summary, but I encourage you to do that on your own time because it's late. And also, if you go to the lesson page, let me expand this, you will see that the lesson after this one is called using Git using the Git staging area. That lesson is one that I plan to skip because it has quite a bit of an overlap with the one that we already covered. So if you feel like that you did the exercises on the basics and you feel confident, and if you want to try something new but it's more or less related to what we did as to refresh, I encourage you to do on your own time this lesson here. But the next time we come back to this series, we are going to be working with one of the most useful lessons and doing things in Git. So that's the end of today's meetup. And I would like to announce that I'm looking for volunteers to lead the meetup next week because I'm going to be on a vacation. So it's an opportunity for anyone who is interested to talk about, like a topic that is outside what we've been covering, or if you're interested in Git, you are welcome to start with the lesson and doing things. Okay. So with that, I thank you all for being here. We'll be in touch on Slack.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Thanks, Mara.